Matt.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of WestWater Research, I'd like to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. We really appreciate your interest and participation. My name is Matt Payne, and I will be your moderator today. As a note before we get started, I'd like to inform everyone that the session is being recorded. We'll be distributing that recording after we're done to everyone who signed up, so everyone will get a recording of the session. Also, feel free on the right, there's an opportunity to chat in comments or questions. So we'll be taking questions. If everyone can chat in questions, we'll be happy to kind of take those at the end. Now, I'm understanding that there's some difficulties with the video and the audio. Can folks hear me?
Matt, I can hear you.
Great, I'm getting lots of yeses. Fantastic. That's great. Let me turn the camera on, see if we can get the cameras working. Okay. So I'll set the stage. We're here today to talk about water and almonds. As everyone knows, almonds are a big business in California. Just to provide some stats, back in 2010, the state had 850,000 acres of bearing and non-bearing almonds. Fast forward to last year, 2020, we've got 1.6 million acres of almonds in the state. So almond acreage has nearly doubled in just 10 years. So despite the growth in the almond industry in California, the sector is facing some challenges. So we have much softer, much lower almond prices than we did back at the peak in 2015. In addition, the almond industry is facing unprecedented risk around water supply and water resources. That risk is coming from drought, it's coming from environmental regulation, and it is also coming from the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is limiting pumping of groundwater in many areas. So to manage those risks, increasingly almond growers are turning to the water market and acquiring additional water supplies through market-based transactions. The water market's becoming increasingly important to almond production in the state. Our purpose with today's program is to provide some insight on what's happening in the almond market and also California's water market. We're going to be hearing from two of the preeminent experts in both of those markets on current market conditions. And in addition, we're going to be talking about how the almond market and water market are impacting one another and how they relate to one another. So I'll begin by introducing our panelists. From Stratamarkets, we have Michael Easterbrook. Michael is the founder and managing director of Stratamarkets, which is the leading independent provider of benchmark prices and market intelligence for the global almond market. Prior to Stratamarkets, Michael spent 15 years working in multiple leadership roles for S&P Global Platts and Argus, two of the world's largest commodity price data companies. He lives in Houston, Texas when he's not on the road in California, has a son and two daughters. So Michael, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and expertise. In addition, we're joined by Sarah Woolf, who is the president of WaterWise. Sarah has been working in agriculture and water for her entire career. As a farmer, she personally experiences the same challenges that everyone is facing with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and farming in California. Her strength is the ability to bring individuals of varying positions together to find manageable solutions to difficult problems. WaterWise provides a platform for multi-jurisdiction engagement on behalf of clients to create a vibrant San Joaquin Valley community. So thanks so much, Sarah, for joining us as well. At this point, to kick us off, I'd like to turn it over to Michael to provide some insight in history on what's happened in the almond market in terms of price performance and what some of the drivers are behind almond prices. So Michael, over to you. Thanks so much.
Yep, good. Thanks for the introduction, Matt. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to be here participating in the conversation with you and Sarah. Before I start, I want to warn everyone, I've been having some sudden spotty internet problem. So if I fade out, that's the reason. But hopefully it's been stable for a couple minutes, so I hope it stays that way. Let me make these slides a little bit bigger. I actually wanted to start the presentation by talking a little bit about who we are and what Stratamarkets does. So really, essentially, we are a commodity market data firm, and we're the leading independent provider of benchmark prices and market intelligence for the global almond market. So the core sort of product that we supply is price data. And around this price data, we also provide market analysis and news and other analytical tools for companies in the almond trade. We're a very new company, so we just started selling our services in January of this year, but we already have a growing global network of clients that include almond packing companies, both in California and Australia, almond growers, some of the big end-use buying companies, banks, trading and broking firms, and other stakeholders in the market. And really, when you look at what we do, the proprietary price data and market intelligence that we provide helps companies do a number of things. It helps them discover price in the global almond market, which is a very, very opaque, difficult market to track. It helps them benchmark performance, so to see how they're doing relative to other companies in the marketplace. And finally, it helps them manage price risk. And as Matt mentioned earlier, it's a very volatile price environment that we've been in and that we're probably going to be in for quite some time. So that's a little bit about Stratamarkets. I'm going to be talking quite a bit about market prices in this presentation. But before I do that, I kind of wanted to set the stage by explaining the specific market that Stratamarkets tracks. And that market is what's known as the industrial almond market. And I've attempted to sort of illustrate it in the slide that you're looking at here. And I wanted to start with the diagram on the left, which is a very extremely simplistic illustration of the almond supply chain. And it really begins with growers feeding their product into the packing companies. The packing companies, in turn, will sell into these large trading firms, food importing companies, food distribution companies, and other sort of big end-use users of almonds. And the almonds will sort of continue to wind their way through this supply chain after this. But one of the features of trade between packers and this next layer in the supply chain is that trade occurs in minimum volume sizes of about 44,000 pounds, which is essentially the quantity of almonds that you can fit into one of these shipping containers that you can see on the right. So that's essentially the industrial almond market. Again, it's trade between these two layers of companies for minimum volume sizes of 44,000 pounds or more, right? So this is the market that we're tracking. And one of the reasons we focus on this market is the price in the industrial almond market really has a ripple effect throughout the entire supply chain. So what I mean by that is the price in this market will determine what you and I pay for almonds at the grocery store. It will affect the price that we pay for any of a number of almond products out there: almond flour, almond butter, almond milk. The list goes on. And perhaps even more importantly, it will affect and really determine the price that growers receive from the packing companies for the almonds that they're producing. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that the sort of the entire supply chain really pivots around the price in this industrial almond market. Now, I wanted to talk about price. So at Stratamarkets, we essentially track price assessments for 17 different items that are trading in this industrial almond market that I've just described. We're about to add an 18th price assessment very soon. Two of the price assessments are shown in the slide that you're looking at now. And those prices include an item called Standards, which is depicted in the orange line at the bottom. And Standards is really a sort of a basket of different varieties that is typically used for manufactured products, right? The other item that I'm showing here is called Nonpareil In-Shell. And as the name implies, it's an item that is still sold with the kernel and the shell. And this is a very, very popular item in countries like India and China. So it's typically an item that's exported from California. So the price data that you're looking at here is for the start of the crop year in California, which begins in August, and it goes up to the present. In fact, this is reflective of prices as of yesterday at noon Pacific time. So this is pretty fresh price data. And before I talk about what's kind of happened with prices this crop year, I wanted to sort of bring you up to speed on what prices were doing before, because it's a pretty interesting story. And it really sort of starts in the 2008-2009 period. At that point, almond prices in the industrial market really began a pretty impressive bull run up over the next several years, and sort of hit a high of, and depending on which item you're talking about, of sort of $4 to $5 per pound by early 2015. At that point, they begin a pretty quick, steep downward movement over the next 12 months. They hit their low in kind of the early 2016 period. From then until 2020, they climbed back up gradually, but kind of oscillating within a sort of $2.25 to $3.50 kind of price bracket. What happened then is at the start of 2020, they really began another descent downward. And that really continued for several months. And they actually hit their low at the start of this crop year. So going back to the slide that you're looking at, the price data that you're seeing here, this series really begins with prices at an historic low for California, right? Now, what prices have done since then is pretty interesting. So they tried to run up and rally in kind of the December time period. That lasted for a few weeks. It fizzled. Prices came back down. They tried to rally again in kind of the December time period. They came back down again. What prices have done since then gets a little bit more complicated and complex, and it really depends on what item you're talking about, because again, there's a lot of different items that trade in this market, and each item has almost its own sort of supply and demand driver, right? So they can behave very differently. And this slide kind of illustrates that. So one example is the in-shell market. Again, this is a very popular item in India and China. One of the things that we began to hear about in kind of the late winter, early spring was that packing companies were running short of in-shell at a time when there was still really strong demand from India. And that's one of the reasons that you see, from kind of this March to the present, prices for nonpareil in-shell are continuing to climb. Now, it's a different story for standards. Again, this is a sort of a basket of different varieties of almonds, and it's a basket of almonds that tend to be a little bit lower in grade and quality, and smaller in size. And it's this type of almond that California is expected to end the current 2020-21 crop year with quite a large supply of, right? And so the large supply of this type of almond is really keeping the lid on prices for standards, as you can see here. So I wanted to move on now to supply and demand and switch slides. So I think this sort of supply and demand story for almonds in the industrial market this crop year can kind of be summed up by saying it's been a crop year of record supply that's also been met by record demand. And I wanted to start with the supply story first. So this crop year, again, the 2020-2021 crop year, which will end in July, California is going to produce a record quantity of almonds. It's going to be probably a little bit more than 3.1 billion pounds of almonds, which again is an historic level of production for the state. And the reason for this is really illustrated in the chart that you can see on the left, which is that California has just planted a lot of almond acreage. So the chart that I'm showing here shows you both bearing acres. So these are acres that are currently in production and being farmed. It also shows you the non-bearing acreage, which is acreage that is recently planted and not yet in production. We don't yet have an estimate for 2021 non-bearing acreage, but you can see from the chart that really we've, over this past previous 10-year period, we've seen a gradual uptick in acreage planted. And this is the reason that we have record production in California right now. Now, fortunately for sellers, that record production has also been met by record demand. And that's a result of a number of things. One is the popularity of almonds. So this is an item that's viewed as being extremely healthy and a sort of a beneficial item to consume. So they're very popular. Manufactured almond products are extremely popular as well. The other thing that's really helped is the low price environment. So this has allowed companies that weren't previously purchasing almonds to begin purchasing. It's also allowed companies that have traditionally purchased a lot of almonds, confectionaries, for example, to increase the quantity of almonds that they're purchasing because the price is so low. But the demand that we've seen is really kind of best illustrated in these monthly shipment figures that are tracked by the Almond Board of California. And that's what I'm showing here on the chart on the right. So what this shows specifically is in orange, the monthly shipments for the current crop year. So that starts in August. The most recent data we have is through until April. And alongside it in blue are the monthly shipments for the previous crop year. So what you can see here is, with the exception of 1 month, California has really shipped out a record level of almonds. What you can't see is sorry, can you guys still hear me?
Yes, Michael, we can hear you. You dropped
Okay,
momentarily, but you're back.
Okay, good. That was I'm glad I got that far in the presentation. So that's a quick look at demand. The one final point that I wanted to make is, and this isn't shown in the slide, but last week the USDA's NAS service came out with a new the first of 2 crop forecasts for the 2021-2022 crop year, and it's predicting another year of record production from California, 3.2 billion pounds of almonds, which would be about 100 million pounds more than California produced this crop year. And this is where I think the conversation really intersects pretty nicely with water, because we've seen a lot of pushback from packing companies to this forecast. And one of the points that packing companies make is that the difficulties that growers are going to face accessing affordable water means that growers are going to be pulling a lot of bearing acreage from production simply because it's not profitable. And packers will go on further to say that NAS may not have correctly accounted for this in its forecast. So this is a very, very hot debate right now in the market. It's having it will have an effect on price, and it's a debate and a conversation that I think is going to be continuing for at least the next 2 months. So with that, Matt, I wanted to turn it back over to you.
Data in the almond market, so no doubt has tremendous value. Before we move on to Sarah, we did get a couple of questions chatted in that I thought we'd run through. So the first 2 questions are on your price data chart. What is the unit on the vertical axis? Is that dollars per pound or something else?
So yes, it's dollars per pound, and those are I should be more specific. They're U.S. FAS prices as well.
Okay, and for those of us who aren't sure what FAS is, what does that mean? Looks like we may have dropped you. Oh,
I think I'm back. Yeah, sorry about that.
So what does FAS price mean, and is that during a trade, or is that the price received by the grower?
Yeah, so FAS, it's an Incoterm. It stands for free alongside ship, or also freight alongside ship. It's also referred to. But essentially, this is the terms of trade during which through which a buyer will agree to take possession of a container at the point of exit for California, which for California is either the Port of Oakland or the Port of Long Beach, right? So it's just it's an Incoterm that specifies the point at which, again, the buyer will take possession of the container from the seller. And to answer your question, so yes, it's effectively this this industrial price or this FAS price. They can also trade on a delivered basis, but it's this price that the grower will get back from the packer minus the packing company's margin and cost and profit.
Understood. So you can kind of back into what price the grower's going to receive. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And there should be a correlation there. So they'll move directionally in the same way, but there may be some difference.
There should be, yeah, and in fact there is. So effectively, the prices that we publish, if you subtract the margin that packers are taking, that will be the price that growers are getting back from the packing company.
Okay, and what is that that price plus profit range? Is it 30 cents, 50 cents? What would you guess? Michael, are you with us? Okay, he's reconnecting. So let's let Michael reconnect. And then in the meantime, let's move on to Sarah. As I mentioned previously in her bio, Sarah is an expert on the California water market and also has very personal experience being an almond grower in the Valley. So I'm going to share her slides and allow her to start by giving us some background on the water situation in California and characterizing the water market for us.
Okay, thank you, Matt. And I think I'm lucky. My image isn't showing up, so I'm kind of relieved about that. But yes, I'm going to give you a little overview of water in California, and so you have a little better picture of where the water is coming from and how far it has to get to reach all these almond trees that are throughout California. So on the first slide here, we have California, and the yellow lines are federal water projects that the federal government has paid for. Oops, if you could go, there we go. Probably should start at the beginning. The blue are the major rivers within California. The red are state projects, so projects that the state of California owns and operates. And the yellow, as I said, are federal projects that the US federal government installed and operate. There are many local projects, which you might see in the green. And then, so this represents all the major water projects in California. This isn't all the local projects or all of the projects, but the major arteries that are bringing water through California. And while we're here on this same slide, I just want to make the point that Redding, which is the top of the state, is the location of the largest reservoir for the federal project, Shasta Dam. And that is where the bulk of the water supply is released, captured, and released from. And as you can see, as it goes down into the heart of California, the line ends. And that ends in the Sacramento Delta, in the delta that is the estuary that eventually makes its way out through the San Francisco Bay and into the Pacific Ocean. But the delta is a myriad of waterways, islands that this water commingles in, and the San Joaquin River, the tributaries off the Sierras all feed into this delta. And then at the southern part of this delta, you'll see a red and a yellow line start again. That is where the federal and state systems have their pumping facilities. They literally pump water that theoretically was dumped in the northern part of the delta and meandered and made its way down to the southern part of the delta, is lifted up out of major pumping facilities, two separate ones owned by the respective entities. And it travels down a major waterway through the heart of California on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. You'll see that the line is yellow for the first part and then becomes red as it makes its way to the southern part of the valley, and then all the way down as far south as San Diego. So that is water that is originating north of Sacramento in Northern California and making its way as far south as San Diego, makes its way over into Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo. So it is reaching many, many locations within California. And the next slide will show the waterway. And if any of you have traveled along Interstate 5 in California, this is the major water system that feeds from north to south the bulk of California water supply, both urban, agricultural, and environmental. So as you're driving from Los Angeles to Sacramento along Interstate 5, this is you're constantly crisscrossing this waterway, and that is California's main artery. So this next slide, Matt, is a progressive slide, and it's meant to show that before we started, in California, when these projects were built between the 50s to the 70s, the purpose was to improve economic activity and provide water to the growing populations in California. That was why the systems were built. And over time, the demands of those systems have changed. Historically, the purpose was for a strong, steady supply to municipalities for human consumption and a variable supply to agriculture because it could ebb and flow with hydrology in the state. So if we were in a dry year, agriculture would take the hit of a lower water supply because they had the flexibility, whereas a household would still need running water to continue with daily life. So those were the main purposes of the system. But in the mid-90s, we had legislation passed in 1992 that dedicated a significant portion of the water supply in California to environmental purposes and to improving the environmental situation in California. And so this slide, as we progress through it, is going to show various regulations that have come into place to both enhance environment and water quality in California, and primarily in the Delta, in the San Joaquin, Sacramento Delta. And so these are the months of the year that we can pump, all months of the year. And as each slide progresses, it fills in with a new regulation and limitations in those months for pumping restrictions. So this is 1992. Then each year we have new months that have new regulations on them for different purposes. And as we get to the end of this slide, you'll see that all of the months are covered with regulations that we have to adhere to that consequently limit the flexibility and the pumping capabilities of the system in California. So all of these regulations have various purposes and serve different needs, but are nonetheless have to be adhered to and consequently reduce the amount of water supply that is going out to the population of California. So the next slide. So this is a delivery chart of the federal water project in California. And so specifically Westlands Water District, which is where my family farms and I do the bulk of my work. They are a federal contractor. They receive federal water supply. They have some of the most, or in total acreage, the bulk of the acreage in Westlands Water District is dedicated to almonds, or a significant portion. And so the water supply as it relates to almonds in Westlands is very critical. And you can see on this map, the gray is the precipitation that we had in that year, so rainfall totals. And then the blue is, and the blue dot is the initial allocation, the light blue, excuse me, is the initial allocation. So they tell us in February or March how much water we might be anticipating that year. And you can see up until 1992, thereabouts, we were most years, with the exception of one, receiving 100% of our allocation. So what that equates to is we were receiving 2.5 acre feet of water for every acre of land that we farmed. But in 1992, when those regulations became enacted and more regulations came in subsequent years, you can see the volatility just becomes far more extreme, and getting down to those zero allocations in the years of 2009, 2014, 2015, and now in 2021, we are seeing significant changes in the security of that water supply. And almonds are unique in that they really need a nice, good quality water supply to produce a crop. They're very sensitive with respect to the different constituents that they can handle and not negatively impact their crops. So something that is typically in groundwater in the area, and groundwater is what we rely on if we're not getting this surface supply, it has high levels of boron coming up from the earth. And so when that boron tainted water hits an almond tree, we can lose the almond crop. And so it's very important that we get these cleaner water supplies if we're hoping to produce a crop. So these zero allocations and very low allocations mean that we're going almost exclusively to groundwater. And so it's critical that we find alternative sources, or we have ways of improving that water supply. Sorry, somebody said you can't hear me. I hope you can hear me all right. I'll lean in a little closer. So Matt, could you go to the next slide? Or is that all of them? I think that's all of them. So, so this volatility in water supply has really forced growers to determine how many acres of almonds they can sustain on their property. And as I said, a full allocation is 2.5 acre feet. Almonds take typically 4 acre feet. So what a farmer will do is he will have an empty acre of land for every acre of almonds he has to try to maximize any water supply onto that almond tree. And then if he has to rely on his well water, he will typically blend it with his surface supply to get a slightly improved water quality. And in a year like this, when we have a zero allocation, many growers with almonds, but not enough surface supply, are going out to other growers that don't have almonds and asking to buy their water so that they can move it over to their farm and service their almond crop. That has created a very high pricing and profitable situation for the grower with the water. Normally, if you had a surface supply coming from your water district, you would be paying about $400 an acre foot for that water. If you're buying it from your neighbor because he just has extra or has chosen to not grow a crop with that particular water supply, the spot market this year is $2,000 an acre foot. So it is a very high markup. There's very limited supplies in the system overall throughout the state, but specifically in these water districts that have zero water supply. And so if you're putting $2,000 water on your land to grow an almond crop that you only get a return of $1.50 to $2, you have spent 100% of your profit or your income on your water supply. So it causes the question of, is it worth it to keep this tree in the ground and produce a crop that is going to come in at a negative income? So many farmers are just buying enough water to keep their trees alive, but maybe not produce a crop. Maybe they're putting that boron water on to keep the tree alive, but not anticipating a crop of any size. Or they're willing to take a loss this year in hopes that the market responds with limited supplies and they can make it back next year. But this tree is in the ground typically for 20 years. So you are often investing at a loss to keep the tree alive so that you can continue out the remaining 10, 12, however many years left you have on that crop. So, so the price being at $1.50 to $2 right now is not encouraging to the almond farmer, but I think the hope is with these high prices and the likelihood that many acres are going to have to come out of production from either lack of enough supply of water or a farmer deciding that it's just not going to be profitable soon enough to be able to sustain that cost of carrying that tree without a profitable crop. Many acres will most likely come out, and hopefully that will help to improve the market price, and that in the next year with a lighter supply, we will have a higher market. And I'm being tempted to read over to the questions, but Matt, with that, would you want me to deal with some of these questions that are coming up?
Yes, that would be great. So one that was asked earlier when Michael was presenting that maybe we can start with is, if you had to guess, how many growers are going to make the decision to, instead of buying supplemental water, take trees out this year? What is that going to look like?
You know, it's really hard to predict that. And I think you see that in some of the forecasts that are coming out, that it's very hard to know what that tipping point is for any individual farmer. You know, it depends on many factors, what your capital capacity is, how many years you can carry that, what your options are for future water supplies. And if you think that this long-term has viability to have a water supply, I would say, based on my chart that I showed you of all the regulations that have limited water supply, most farmers feel that that is not going to improve, but rather probably continue to get worse with the growing demands of the resource of water on California. And so if a crop is at all marginal, the tree never produced as well as one anticipated, or the ground isn't yielding or treating the tree right, that might precipitate an early almond crop coming out. I know in our own family, my husband's family made the decision to take 400 acres of trees out this year that were only 15 years old. So they should theoretically be in the prime of their production, but they were only producing marginally. They weren't doing as well as they had anticipated. And as a total, the farm did not have enough water to supply those trees. And so, you know, they are generally the lowest producing of the group of almonds that they have. So they decided to sacrifice those at this time in hopes that the other trees would continue to produce in a healthy way.
Certainly. Well, it sounds like a complex decision that growers are faced with during these drought periods. Now, you mentioned spot market water trading at $2,000 per acre foot in Westlands. Are buyers of that water easily able to find sellers, or is it pretty challenging to find willing sellers this year, regardless of price?
This year, it is very challenging to find sellers. There simply is not as much water in the system. There is limitations for everyone. Normally, you just see these limitations for those users that are south of the Delta. But this year, throughout the state, everyone is having a very, very low water supply. It's drought throughout the state. And so that availability in some places and not in others is not playing out this year. Everyone is tight. So that's in large part helping to push that price up to such a high level.
Understood. And then one more question before we move to the more formal Q&A that just came in. What impact are almond prices, current hydrology, and water prices having on land values in, for example, Westlands?
Amazingly, land values are holding strong. And I think, you know, that is a lot driven outside of agriculture. It's still a positive place to invest in land. But even without water supply that looks sustainable for the long term, there has been a lot of pressure on sustaining high prices on those land values. So that is the good news, that if you make some decisions to get out of the farming operation, there is still a lot of value in the land.
Sure. And if you had to estimate a range of land values currently per acre, what would you say they're trading at right now in Westlands?
Yeah, well, it varies drastically between water districts, but in Westlands, I think depends on if have open ground or trees producing, but I think we're in $15,000 an acre range for open ground, and could be double or almost double of that for producing almond trees.
Sure, great. Well, thanks so much, Sarah. Great intro to the water issues that are impacting almond growers, and a little bit of a primer on the water market. And I want to get back to some questions on the water market in a little bit. But first, jumping back to Michael, when we dropped you, we were asking, what is that profit margin that the packers take, and how would growers translate that to their price? Is there a sort of rule of thumb you use, 30 cents a pound, 50 cents a pound? What would that be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't track the margin that the packing companies are taking. I think there's a lot of packing companies, and I think they all have their different costs and profits that they're taking. There's large packers, there's small ones. So I think it really just is going to depend on the company. Unfortunately, I don't have a rule of thumb. Any number I would say would be a wild guess and would probably cause more confusion than clarity. So I think I'll refrain from throwing out a number if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. Is there anything almond packing companies can do to maximize the prices that they're receiving?
They can. There's actually a lot. It becomes very strategic. And in fact, it's happening now. One of the big decisions that packing companies are going to be trying to answer is how much in-shell to make for the coming crop year. Again, just harken back to that slide that I showed earlier. The premiums that packing companies are getting for that nonpareil in-shell has been pretty impressive. And so the question that they're asking now is, okay, how much do we make for the 2021-2022 crop year? If they make too much, the price isn't going to be quite as punchy. But if they make too little, they're going to be missing out on potentially a lot of money, because again, it's a premium item. The other thing they can do is, typically they try to stay away from selling standards, which is the item that you saw in the slide as well. It's a very inexpensive item. There's not a lot of. Sorry, I think I'm back. Yeah, good. So on standards, there's not a lot of margin that packers make selling that. So they really try to stay away from that and focus more on selling kind of sized, higher quality, more popular items.
Great, thank you. And then how are almond sellers managing price risk in the market?
It's difficult. This is the almond market has become a very large specialty commodity market, but large nonetheless. It's a global market, and it's one of the few sort of commodity markets that you see out there where there's not for instance, a financial instrument, a derivative product to hedge market risk. You don't have that. You do have one contract in India, but it's only available for companies that are based in India. So any packing company or any end use buyer, for that matter.
Matt, while he's rebooting, I could speak just quickly to the crop insurance that farmers have options for as a risk.
Please, that would be great. And then there was another question that just came in around conversion to pistachios. So if you wouldn't mind tackling that one too, that'd be fantastic.
Okay. Yeah, on the grower side, there are some federally mandated crop protection programs that growers can participate in, a crop loss protection insurance program that you buy into. So many farmers do utilize those programs. They are expensive, but in a drought situation or crop disaster, it can be very beneficial. And then the question regarding conversion to pistachios or other crops. Yes, there is a large debate, I think, amongst growers as to what's the better crop to be in as far as permanent crops, almonds or pistachios. Almonds typically have a life of 20 years or so, And pistachios, no one knows how long of a life they have. Generally, they have not been removed from lack of production at this point in time. They seem to have an endless life. So that, I think, is yet to be seen as to how that impacts the marketability of pistachios if we start to produce more than we can consume, whereas almonds naturally kind of help their supply and demand issues on their own just through attrition. But the benefit of pistachios over almonds on a growing perspective is that they can handle very brackish, rough water, and it doesn't harm them much. They can even be very deficit irrigated and even not irrigated at all for a period of time, a year, and they may not produce as strong of a crop the following year, but to date, they have not shown signs that they would actually die off. And so that's in this volatile water market, it's very helpful to have that kind of security. So pistachios get a little more favor because of that durability.
Market. Obviously, you mentioned purchasing water, supplemental water is one approach that growers can use to managing water risk and water shortages. What else can almond growers do to manage their water risk?
They can participate in groundwater banking projects that are in various parts of the state. There's risk associated with those if the banking project is not close to the growing area. There may be difficulties in retrieving that water in a time of drought. They can partner with neighbors or neighboring water districts with better water supplies and have some long-term trading agreements with them. And so I look at an individual farmer's water supply similar to a stock portfolio or an investment portfolio, that hopefully they have multiple options, none of which are 100% foolproof, but that they could rely on in different scenarios and water types. So they would have their district water supply, they would have some groundwater that they could tap into, they probably would have an arrangement with a neighboring water district that could help supplement some of their needs, and probably some in a groundwater bank somewhere to help diversify their water options.
Sure, and a lot of the approaches you mentioned there are market-based approaches to managing water risk. So given the prevalence of almond growers in the water market, to what extent are water prices and almond prices correlated, and does one drive the other?
Unfortunately, as example of this year, the almond price is low, the water market's high. They're not directly correlated. I think the almond market is much delayed in catching up with what the water market is. So I think it could be a year or two before we see the rebound of almond prices to match the difficulty of obtaining water, both economically and physically. And that will take some catch-up time, and it appears to in previous years that it takes some time to show the effects of high water markets.
And I wanted to ask Michael this, but he's dropped. So Sarah, I'll ask you. In other areas of the almond market, for example, the packers, how focused are they on water risk? Obviously, it's front and center for the growers, and it's something the growers think about every day, but is the rest of the industry concerned about water risk?
Yeah, I think they definitely are. I think from a packer's perspective, they don't want to be pulling all of their almonds from one water district or one specific region where, there might be convenience and cost savings in travel of that product to the packer, but to guarantee that they have the supply necessary to meet the demands of their buyers, they're probably buying almonds from multiple regions within the state so that they can ensure that they also don't come up short due to a water crisis.
Their source of supply, just like the growers are doing with water, it sounds like.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting. So we've got a question in the question panel about the impact of Sigma on almond acreage. Sarah, can you comment on what's happening with Sigma for our audience, and what impacts it'll have on almond growing?
Yeah, for sure. Sigma is a very big issue in California. It is a recently passed legislation, I believe it was in 2014, that in the state of California, historically, a landowner could pump as much groundwater out of the ground below him as he or she felt they needed to. With Sigma, there is new law in place that a region, a sub-basin, so they are not necessarily geographically broken up, but more politically broken up, areas have to have a sustainable groundwater management plan. And so that means that they have to show that they're going to only extract an amount of water from below the earth, from out below the surface, as they're going to put back in on the top in subsequent years. So every region of California will have to do this. Specifically right now, the first tier is in the San Joaquin Valley. They are analyzing how much water they can pump year in and year out from the ground and sustain without any negative impacts. Those negative impacts can be the ground is sinking, there's loss of storage capacity in the underground aquifer, so your water tables have dropped. All of those things are being monitored, and you have to show that you are not adversely impacting those issues. So with that legislation, what used to be an open number as to how much you could pump is now going to be regulated, typically by your water district. And in most cases, very significantly. And in groundwater has been a backstop, a cost saver, something we can lean on in times of drought, but also a much cheaper water supply often than the surface supply is. And so now that is going to be limited significantly. Valley-wide, the number works out to about a half acre foot per acre that a farmer could pump from the groundwater, or anyone, community. And so the limitation of that is just going to further limit the supply that's available to farmers as a whole. So it's definitely impacting, and it's being implemented right now. It has to reach its full capacity. It has to show that it's completely sustainable and maintaining a sustainable state by 2040. So we have from now until 2040 to slowly ramp down the usage, wean ourselves off the usage of that groundwater supply.
Reduction in pumping, I have to assume, will translate to fewer irrigated acres. Unfortunately, it's just a question of how many, right? So,
Correct.
Coming up at the end of our hour here, so I want to pose my final question to each of our panelists, starting with Sarah. We focused a lot of this program on the risks in the almond market and in the water market, and some of the headwinds that we're facing in those markets. But clearly, there are still growing industries, and there are plenty of people still making money despite those challenges. So, given all of that, are you bullish or bearish on California water? And how about almonds? Same question.
Well, I personally am bullish on California water because I think and almonds both, honestly, but the water specifically because I think the entire state is suffering from the impacts of a resource that we have not continued to enhance and improve upon. And so I think that we will have far more interest in maximizing the precipitation we get in California and doing more and better things with that precipitation and getting more out of it. And so I think that we will have improved water systems. And I think almonds will continue to be a positive crop in large part because it has an end life. And so you're reevaluating it every 20 years. And so I think that will help adjust with the supply and demand issues of almonds.
insurmountable. Great perspective, Sarah. And how about you, Michael? Are you a water bear or a water bull? And are you an almond bear or an almond bull? It looks like right on cue he dropped again. So given his transition recently into providing data to the almond market, I have to assume that he's bullish on the market. So is that a fair assessment, Michael?
I'm bearish on my internet service provider.
Yeah.
After this call, I'm going to go out and get a new one. I really apologize for all this. I can attempt to talk about some of the supply and demand drivers that market participants are looking at, but I'm worried if I get into the discussion, it'll cut out very quickly. I will say, just in terms of the supply, I mean, everyone is again really looking at the forecast for the 2021-22 crop year. There was the first that NAS put out last week. There will be a second, which will come out in July. So the market's going to be, very focused on that. On the demand side, I don't think there's any expectation that demand is going to decrease. I think there's every sign that demand will be strong. Whether it can overcome the supply and pull prices back up sort of remains to be seen.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, Michael. I think that brings us to the end of our program for the day. Reminder to everyone, this will be recorded. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties we had with the Demio platform, but we managed through it, and I think managed to still have an informative discussion. So again, I want to thank our panelists and everyone for joining. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.